Okay, we're back. This next lecture, I just want to briefly introduce you to the software. We talked about it a little bit in the last one. I'm going to give you a few more details in this one, okay? But I'm going to start by talking about some common newbie problems. At least in my experience, when students are first learning GIS, these are some issues that consistently crop up. And the first is basic operations in the software. How do I save a file, and where do I find this button, and how do I do this, and how do I do that? How do I load in data? How do I zoom? How do I zoom out? Some of the things that I showed you last lecture, and I'm going to go in more detail about this lecture. So that's what this lecture is about. File management. That's the next lecture we're going to talk about. As I mentioned before, the files are large, and it's kind of a complicated file scheme that you have when you're working with ArcGIS, and consequently I want to talk to you about that. I want you to understand what makes it complicated, and I want to give you some tips on how you can manage your files so that you don't lose data and so that you can go to any computer and it still works. Projections, this will be the next lecture or an upcoming lecture. We talked about latitude, longitude in the last lecture, and you're probably familiar with that. And that's a great way for finding a specific point on the Earth. But it's not always the best way to make maps. And so we have something called a projection, which is where we take those lat-long coordinates and we project them into a different scheme that might be better for mapping in one way or the other. So that's often a source of confusion for students, and we're going to talk about that. And finally, simply finding data and downloading it. That doesn't sound like that should be a big problem, but it actually is. It's kind of annoying. There's tons of data out there, but when you go Googling for it and searching for it, it's often hidden behind some very complicated websites, or there's often lots and lots of information on these websites, and you got to kind of sort through and find exactly what you want. And that's a skill, and that's one of the reasons we have you do a project at the end of this class, is so that you can practice that skill. So just like a lot of things, there's lots of information out there at your fingertips, but finding good quality information, that's a skill that you need to develop. So this sort of gives you an outline of some of the next topics we're going to cover, and certainly these are all things that we're going to practice all semester. Okay, so the first one I mentioned had to do with just basic operations in the software, and so let's talk about that now. I'm going to introduce you to ArcView, or it's called ArcMap now, ArcCatalog, and ArcToolbox. Okay, and these are all sub-programs, or they're all programs of a bigger concept called ArcGIS. And sometimes I'll just call the program ArcGIS, and sometimes I'll call it ArcMap, and sometimes I'll call it ArcView. It doesn't matter, okay? This is made exclusively by the Esri Corporation, ESRI. They're the corporation that makes anything Arc. So if you hear ArcMap, or ArcTools, or ArcCatalog, or ArcGlobe, or ArcScene, these are all programs. You know they're part of Esri's ArcGIS overall, ecosystem, for lack of a better word. And so that's, I mentioned before that they're kind of the only game in town as far as commercial GIS software. I know that there's a lot of others out there, and I know that people get very passionate about different softwares, but I'm being realistic. My job is to give you skills that you can use as soon as you leave our university. And most places are running ArcGIS, and that's why I'm going to teach it to you. Now, we will talk about some other options other than ArcGIS, but if you learn ArcGIS, then you can pretty much work on other software as well. And so this is what I talked about. You've got ArcMap, ArcView, Arc whatever. That is something that's made by the Esri Corporation. Now, ArcMap and ArcView, again, I'll kind of use these two terms interchangeably. This is the meat of the system. This is where you're going to spend 99% of your time. This is where you do the work. Okay, this is where you make your maps and do your analysis. It used to be called ArcView, then they changed it to ArcMap. Again, sometimes they'll even call it ArcGIS. This is the meat of the system. Now, very briefly, it's important that you understand the development of this software. And I taught myself the software. I heard about it and learned about it when I was in grad school working on my PhD. So late 90s, right? 1999, 2000 is when I started getting into this. It had been around quite a bit before that. Fish people really weren't using it. Wildlife people were using it a lot more before fish people were. At any rate, back then, the version was 3.2, and that's what I learned on. And that's kind of when it really began to take off and really began to be used by a lot of people. And then pretty soon after I started learning it, so in the early 2000s, I want to say, maybe mid 2000s, it switched from 3.2 up to like 9.0, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. So if you know anything about software, you know that if you go from one whole number to the next, that's supposed to indicate a fairly substantial change and upgrade in the software. This went from the 3s up to the 9s in basically one leap. So it was a complete revolution. They completely redid the software. And what you work with now is going to be version 10, probably 10.3 is kind of where we're at now. And that was a big revision from 9, but of course not nearly the big jump from 3 to 9. Well, why do you need to know all this? Because if you're looking at research papers and earlier research papers and you're trying to use their methods, a lot of times they'll say, if it's an earlier paper, they'll say, this was done in ARC 3.2, 3.1. Well, that's really hard to find anymore. It's not around. However, everything you could do in the early version, you can do in the newer version. It's just you can't directly use exactly their techniques, but that's not really a big deal. The important point is that you understand that the most recent versions are very different than the early versions, which is kind of not a surprise. It's also something that you might want to concern yourself with if you go and you're going to go to get a job and they say, oh yeah, we do ArcView, we've got ArcView 3.2. That's, way out of date. And anybody who's seriously working with ArcGIS now is working in those, version 10, right? Version 9, you don't even see hardly anybody using anymore. And it's also very important to understand these different versions because there are programs and add-ons and things that will work with one version and not the other. And that can be a big source of frustration to you because you have an add-on, an extension, something that works and does exactly what you want, and then ArcMap comes out with an upgrade and all of a sudden all your old extensions don't work. That happens a lot. Somebody will write a really good program, does exactly what you want to do, but it only works on an earlier version of ArcMap. So sometimes it's good to have old versions just laying around on different computers for that reason. It happens more often than we'd like it to. And so that's something to be aware of. So ArcMap is where you do most of your work, like I mentioned. And this is what I showed you. I showed you kind of a demo of this on the last lecture. Here's another picture of it, just to introduce you to some terminology. Down at the bottom, you've got a little toggle where you can toggle between the data view and the map view. And so that's talking about this big view in the middle where the work is being done, where the map is being shown. You can either have it as data view or map view. And most of the time, you're going to be in data view. This is where you do all your work, okay? But then you can toggle it to map view. Map view will have the same information, but this is where you make your pretty maps. And so map view is for doing things like adding a north bar and a scale, a north arrow and a scale bar. You can do formatting. So that's why they have two different views. One is just for doing the work, one is for making the pretty maps. And that's all in the data frame, which is in this big main window. I've already mentioned over to the left you got the table of contents, which is labeled table of contents in our most recent version. And so all the data files that you load in will show up in the table of contents. And I showed you last time how you can drag them above or below others to make them stack above or below others in the data frame, and you can check and uncheck boxes, and you can change the formatting, and you can do a lot of things to each data file in the table of contents. Okay, big picture, how does all this come together? There are many different kinds of GIS data. I gave you several examples last time. You've got shape files, which is kind of a very common file. And remember, those can be a point or a polyline or a polygon. You've got things like DOQs and DRGs. Those are rasters. Remember, that's a surface of cells, and each cell has a number. And that number might mean elevation above sea level. It might mean depth in a lake. It might mean average rainfall at that spot. It might mean any of a number of things. There are databases, or what are known as geodatabases, which can contain a lot of different kinds of data files, and they can all be packaged together and loaded in. So you just find those on the internet, you make them yourself, you add them to a project in ArcMap. It's very powerful in that it can work with several different types, and as long as they have the proper georeferencing, the software can line them up and can figure out how they relate to each other in a spatial context. And that's what I just said here. All GIS data has a spatial reference, so they all should line up where they belong on the Earth. And the software will do this automatically. That was a big difference between the early version, 3 point whatever, and 9. In 3 point whatever, you had to make sure they were all in exactly the same coordinate system or they wouldn't line up. Now, in the newer versions, they could be in different coordinate systems, and the software can figure it out and line them up. And once you have all those in your ArcView, then you can make a new map based upon those, or you can do spatial analysis based upon those layers, or any of the work you need to do, you're going to do it in ArcMap or ArcView. Now, I mentioned earlier extensions. These are little add-ons. There are lots of different kinds of extensions or add-ons. They're just little things that do a specific task, and you can just run them and they get added on to ArcMap, and then they'll perform that task. Many of those that come with the software now are very essential. These are the 3 that you will definitely use. And sometimes when you install the software, these don't automatically get installed, although they should be. So when you install the software, make sure that you include these extensions: Spatial Analyst, 3D Analyst, and Geoprocessing Analyst. There are others, but these are the 3 you will definitely use. Now, ArcView, ArcMap can be quirky to the point of frustration. It is extremely powerful. It does more things than you'll ever use. There's tons and tons and tons of functionality in this software. You don't need all of that. You only need some of it, right? But with that power comes a price. First off, it's very weird about the files it uses and file locations. That's why we're going to do a whole lecture on file management. It's not like Word or Excel, where you've got a nice little file and you just move it here and you double click on it and it launches and hey, it works, you know, and you email it to somebody. That does not work in ArcMap, all right? It's much more complicated, and it's very picky about where you put files. It's very picky about data layers sometimes. It's getting better, and it is pretty amazing that you can take these data layers of different types, you know, rasters and shape files and E00 files, and they can all play well together in the software. But sometimes, if everything is not just so, the software will crash or it won't run, and it can sometimes be very frustrating. Sometimes the software can just be a little buggy. Sometimes you do everything right and it just doesn't work for whatever reason. Often turning it off and turning it back on solves the problem. Really does, right? I'm telling you this now just so you're mentally prepared for it. This software will drive you crazier than any other software you work with, okay? Again, part of that reason is because it's so powerful and it uses so many different data files that it's difficult sometimes for it to make them all play well together. Sometimes it just does it. And just don't, just breathe deeply, don't punch the monitor. We can get through it. We've never been stopped by a bug yet. We've always figured it out eventually. I just want you to get used to it. Just be prepared that sometimes this software will really frustrate you. But that's also why you're taking this class. You're going to learn all these quirks now so that when you leave the university, then it's no big deal. This also means you need to back up your work, okay? Again, it's not an excuse that, oh, ArcMap crashed, that's why I couldn't turn in my homework. No, that dog don't hunt, all right? You need to be backing things up and you need to start plenty ahead of time so that you can anticipate these problems. Did I mention back up your work often? Back it up, back it up, back it up. Okay. Bottom line is ArcMap will drive you crazy at some point, okay? So just, deal with it, relax, but don't blame the software for your mistakes. And so sometimes I've noticed that I emphasize that the software can be frustrating, and so then students always just blame the software. And most of the time, when a student has trouble and has a complaint and can't get the software to run and they ask for my help, it's not the software's problem, it's the operator error, okay? So don't just think because it's not running, oh, ArcMap is just being buggy. No, most of the time you're doing something wrong. I would say in my experience about 90% of the time when a student can't get something to run, it's because they're doing something wrong. Maybe they don't know they're doing it wrong, maybe we don't realize, oh, you're doing this wrong, but usually I can tell right away they're doing something wrong. About 10% of the time, it's like, wow, I have no idea, the software is just wigging out. All right, so just be prepared. Okay, that's enough about ArcMap. Let's talk about ArcCatalog. This comes with ArcMap. It gets installed with ArcMap. It's a separate program from ArcMap, but they are related and you can access one from the other. ArcCatalog is a direct response to the idea that ArcMap uses crazy file structure, and ArcMap has some crazy ideas about files, okay? And so ArcCatalog is designed, I think, did I say ArcCatalog earlier? Anyway, I'm talking about ArcCatalog. ArcCatalog is designed to work with the files that you use in ArcMap, okay? And so it's kind of like File Explorer in Windows, but it's specifically for GIS files. And it looks a lot like File Explorer. Now, what do I mean by the file structure is weird? If you look at one GIS file, say one shape file, you got that point shape file of cities or a line shape file of rivers. It's one file that you work with. But in real life, and Windows sees that as many files, 5, 6, 7 files. And sometimes they're in different places. Sometimes most of them are in this folder, but one of them is in this folder, right? That's crazy, right? You're not used to that. You're, again, with Word, Excel, PowerPoint, you're used to one file, it's boom, it's here, I move it to my Google Drive, whatever. Doesn't work that way. One GIS file is many Windows files, all right? You can't just use Windows to copy a file from here to there because it's not a file, it's many files. You got to get that in your brain. Let me show you an example. This is what ArcCatalog looks like. Again, it looks very much like File Explorer. It works very much like File Explorer, right? You've got directories on the left, you've got files on the right. There's some quirks here that we'll get into, and you'll when you start working in the book, you'll get into this. All right, let's look at one shapefile in ArcCatalog. And if you look, I've got a single file here on the right side. It's called test shapefile. This is a GIS shapefile, and I could put it in ArcMap and it would be points of something, right? And it's one file. But here, now I'm looking at that exact same file, but I'm looking at it from Windows File Explorer. I'm looking at the files as they sit on the hard drive, not as they are interpreted by ArcCatalog. So this is Windows looking at the exact same file, and look, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 different files, each with a different extension, and they all are necessary to make that one GIS file work. That's why you need ArcCatalog. That's why you need to pay attention to file structure. Okay. Another little program that comes when you install it is called ArcToolbox. And this is what it sounds like. It's lots of little tools, very small programs that do a very specific thing, but stuff that you use over and over again. This is really, really useful. And these days, a lot of people are writing specific little tools to do a specific thing. And they'll put it out there and you can download it and just put it in your toolbox, and then you can do whatever they wrote the program to do. Super useful. A lot of the tools come when you install the software. If you look in ArcMap, there's buttons where you can access ArcCatalog, and there's also buttons where you can access the ArcToolbox. If you're in ArcCatalog, there's a button to launch ArcMap and also a button to launch the ArcToolbox. The ArcToolbox is not so much a program, it's just a collection of little mini programs, organized in a way that you can find stuff. All that stuff can be docked over to the right, and so you can just move your mouse over there and pull them open very quickly. You'll practice all this. When you open the ArcToolbox, again, here you see many toolboxes. Each one has sometimes a sub-toolbox. And within there's all these very useful tools. Another useful thing is there's a search function. So if you're like, I know there's a tool that does this, I don't know where it is, just search for it and it pops right up. Okay, so I mentioned this in the last lecture. I'm going to mention it again. Where can I get the ArcGIS software? Where can I work on things? A lot of the geosciences computer labs in Blackburn should all have it. You just have to watch out, if there's a class or anything in there. If you bought the book, and if it's new, it comes with a trial version of the software. Computers in the library have it. I believe Hart Hall has it. There might be other places on campus. If you hear of any, let me know. And then, again, I can give you one trial version because it's part of our site license and because you're a Murray State student and you're taking the class, I can give you one year trial version. So you can install it on one of your own computers, and you should be able to, work on this anytime you need to work on it. Okay, I mentioned that there are some other options. Again, Esri's Arc suite of tools is the industry standard, what everybody's using. It's very expensive. So there are some open source free versions that are becoming more popular. I'm going to try and work some of these in to some exercises a little bit later, because these are, just because they're open source and they're free, they're not weak. And a lot of important software kind of goes this direction. Like somebody comes out with a really good software and it's very good and costs a lot, and eventually people start writing their own version and give it away for free. A couple of these that I'm familiar with are GRASS. This was done with taxpayer money. I think maybe the Army made this. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure, I know that it was made with taxpayer money, so it's in the public domain. And QGIS is also an open source one. These are two that I'm familiar with. I've played with them a little bit. I can't say a lot about them, but I want you to know they exist, and if we get time, I want you to play with them because they are a pretty good option. If you're student trial version of ArcGIS runs out and you're not somewhere where you can get a new version, this may be a way for you to still be able to work on it. I think they probably will get more popular and more common, and maybe that's what our job is. Maybe our job is to figure these out, and if they work well, then maybe we should spread the word. I don't know. I'm going to concentrate on ArcGIS, introduce you to these, and you can decide which one you like the best. Okay, so that's just my brief intro. Again, I'm just trying to, for those of you who never worked with this before, I'm just trying to get you to wrap your head around what you're getting yourself into. And so we're going to start talking about more specific things in upcoming lectures, and we're going to start getting to work with the software. So if you got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's all I've got right now. See you later.